Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our MWF webinar this week. My name is Tanya. I'm the marketing manager over here at Struxsoft Solutions. For those of you who are new with us today, MWF, or Metalwood Framer, is our automated Revit wall, floor, ceiling, and truss framing software for like-H steel and also wood modeling. Today, however, our senior technician, Christina, will be walking you through our floor module, including how to create and split panels, project bridging types, openings, and floor trusses. Just before we get going, I'd like to remind everyone that at the end of the webinar, we will be taking a few live questions. To be selected, please press the raise hand button on the control panel. Just please also make sure that your mic is working correctly. If you'd prefer, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to hand off to Christina now.
All right, thanks, Tanya. Hey, everyone, good morning. So for today's webinar, I thought we'd keep it pretty simple, and we're going to just look at some of the basics for floors. So we'll look at obviously just how to create them, simple enough. I thought we'd take a look at the two options to split them. We'll take a quick look at the bridging types, some of the opening options that we have for floors. And then I thought we'd touch on maybe something that's not as commonly used, which is the floor trusses, and just how to create and go about editing those. So let's just start with a super simple floor that I just have in my 3D view here. And the first thing I'm actually going to touch on, since we do have a blank floor object, is how to split the floors. So I have done it in a few webinars past, where I do kind of explain that my preferred method is this floor cutter tool. And this guy is super simple. You just draw your line across your floor, grab your actual floor object, and run the floor cutter. So what this is going to do is just break up your floors into two individual floor objects. You can keep the original floor of the model if you need to. So I'll go ahead and keep my original one. And it's basically just going to give you two broken up floor sections kind of overlaid under your original floor. So this is one way that you can go about splitting your floors before even starting to create your panels. And again, it is kind of my preferred method. I think it's probably the simplest, but there are, of course, a few drawbacks to this. So one of the main ones being that you can kind of already tell over here is that if you do have any kind of floor openings, and in my case, this guy was just done with the boundary lines, so I embedded it into the floor. But if you do have any kind of floor openings, because we're essentially replacing it with two floor objects, anything that's done to the profile is going to be overridden, so you're going to lose that opening. And then also maybe on larger projects, this might not be the best way to go about it. It does underlay your floor if you want to keep the original one, and it might make it a little heavy. So what you can do if you don't want to go about this method for splitting is that once the panel's created, we can go ahead and split it with the nodes. So just to kind of reiterate, if you've just got whole floors, maybe without openings, I'd still probably go about it this route. But if you're kind of restricted to keep the model as is, or if you've got a few openings done with the profiles, then I think the node method is probably the way to go. So for anyone who's new to the floors, it's very, very similar to the walls. You just have to grab the floor, say create. You've got a few templates to choose from. These are all the default ones that'll come out of the box with the software. And then, of course, I've just created my own here at 2 feet on center. And then you just go ahead and say create. pretty simple. The only thing I'm not going to do just yet is check this off to say frame it now. So this is probably just the main difference in creating from walls to floors, is that if I just say create without that checkbox, basically does create your floor panel, creates your boundary nodes, your boundary lines that you can see here, but it doesn't actually frame out your floor yet. So it doesn't place the members or frame anything out. So if you are choosing to kind of split it with the node method, then I'd probably just recommend creating your floors like this first without any kind of members in them, run your splits, and then you just have to go ahead and regenerate your floors and you'll get your members to populate. So let's go ahead and do that. To actually split these panels, super simple. You just have to click from node to node. So nodes and the boundary lines are objects that we create for the floor panel, and that's what's actually going to dictate the shape of your floor panel. So if I did want to run a split, maybe run this diagonally, you just have to select from one node to another. It does let you keep on breaking up your floors, but to just get out of this command, you just hit escape, and then you've got your two separate floor objects. So obviously this probably isn't the best way to split this guy. It's going to run across your opening. So let's undo that. But you probably want to split this guy horizontally, kind of in the way that I did it before with the floor cutter. So in that case, you do have the option to place additional nodes wherever you need to on the floor. So I can go ahead and just say place node. Oh, let's grab my panel first. And then it's just going to ask you to pick a point on the boundary line where you want to place these nodes. So generally on the boundary line, if you click a little bit too far away, you will get that message pop up just telling you, so you won't accidentally place any extra nodes that you don't need. But you really just have to click on your boundary lines. In this case, where I want to place that split. And then same idea, I hit escape and I'm out of that command. The other thing with the nodes too, it's okay if they're not perfectly aligned with each other to start off. You can use your Revit align tools and just match these guys up perfectly. From there, we just go ahead and run our split panel again. Click from node to node. You hit escape. And now you've got your floor panels. And just to get your members to actually start populating in now, grab your panels, say regenerate, and it'll populate automatically. So that's the main thing really in terms of splitting panels. You can just add in these extra nodes, basically breaks up these boundary lines for you. And I'm not touching the model at all. My floor hasn't been touched. I've still got my opening. So if you are kind of restricted in that sense with the model, this is probably the better way to go about splitting it up into panels. And the other thing I'll highlight as well, if you ever do accidentally split across two nodes and you've gone a little too far to do the undo with Revit, there is a merge panel option. You can just run that and it's just going to prompt you to select your main panel, which is essentially the panel that's going to stay. You can run your secondary panel and then it merges everything back into one. So if ever you do want to merge two panels together, you could always go back and do that without having to just undo it with Revit. So that's the main points I just wanted to cover today with these splits. The next thing I thought that might be useful as well is to go over some of the opening options in the floors. So for the openings, for the floors, again, kind of similar idea to the walls. We use markers. There's a marker manager completely separate for the floors, but it is just quite a bit simpler. There's two markers to use basically. One that will be joist supported, which is essentially what I have right here, and one that will be rim supported. If you're running openings in floor trusses, we do have the same types of markers that will just frame it out with trusses instead of singular joists. And for anyone who's on the wood side, lumber is really exactly the same in terms of what I'm doing right now. All the openings and the options are really relatively the same. The only thing that will just change are, of course, the cutbacks. So if I go into the option that I have here for the joist supported one, you can see you can kind of duplicate these markers, make as many as you need, and it lets you modify your headers. So just these members that are extending to our next joist. You can modify the trimmers, which are the other members that are just framing out the rest of the opening to cap that off. Any kind of supporting joists that they're attaching onto, you can double them, basically change the type of configuration that you need to for these supporting joists. So maybe I'll go ahead and double these guys up. Any additional families or existing members that you want to add in here, you could always change the sizing, of course, like we would any other marker. But the main thing I do want to talk about for the opening types are these cutbacks. So again, for lumber, your cutbacks are going to be pretty simple. But for light gauge, depending on the profile, you've got a few different cutback options to choose from. And for this particular opening type, it runs from the header to the joist. So these guys here. We've got our trimmers to our headers. So the cutback connections here. And then any kind of partial joists over here, you've also got that option to choose your cutback. So this image you've probably seen a few times. It's in a few other spots in the floors. It's also the same image that's in the blocking for the walls, if anyone's ever used the line-based option. But basically, depending on the profile that you pick, if I pick a track, let's say instead, you've got a few different reference planes to cut back to. And it's just going to depend if it's running into the open side or the hard side of the member. So in this case, we're generally running it into the open side. So you can see here that everything is set to be at plane 1. So if my joist is coming into the open side, it'll actually punch right through to my track, which is probably not the cutback that we want. So if we set everything to plane 2, then it'll cut back. You'll still be able to interlock those two members, but it'll consider the track thickness. And these are both just cutbacks for the member start and member end side that you can choose from. So in terms of the trimmers and the headers, this is actually set to plane 1 because it is technically hitting the hard side. So you're going to want it to stop at that face and not punch through the studs. And then same idea for the partial joists into the headers. So these guys over here, they're hitting the open side of the member, so they're going to be cut back to plane 2. If ever you did want a little bit more wiggle room, you can always put in a custom offset. If I wanted to cut this joist back maybe by 1/4 inch, give myself a bit of a gap, then you do always have this option. It'll pull the partial joist, in this case, back slightly, give you some more wiggle room on that cutback. So then you just really have to say, okay, we've modified just our default joist supported one. And just to kind of highlight the rim supported one, you'll notice it has a lot of the same options, but the rim supported opening option is a bit simpler. Just places extra joists to frame out your opening, and then you've got your headers here to frame that out. So 2 cutback options for those extra members. So once you've kind of made your markers, modified what you need to, there are a few ways that you could go about changing how they're applied. If you go into the properties of the floor, if you do want to reuse the same marker every single time and save that to your template, then you can come into the General tab and you'll be able to set it up in here. But generally, you can also just grab this opening marker, say change opening type, and then you'll be able to select the marker on the fly. If I go ahead and switch it out to the rim supported one, once I regenerate, I'll get that new marker configuration. And I just want to bring it back to the original opening. so we can see the changes that I applied before. You can just see here that 1/4 inch that I applied. And I've also got my double joists that I modified in the marker. So depending on which side of the marker, or excuse me, which side of the member that it's hitting, you'll get your cutback. So I did just orient them and double them up so they're face to face. It's hitting the hard side, so it'll cut it back to plane 1. If it's hitting the open side, it should cut it back to plane 2. So next thing I just want to touch on is the blocking, and then we'll wrap it up today with the floor trusses. So the blocking or the bridging types are created here in the tools, and then they're just placed by marker line. So there are a few other options that you can place in this command. We're just obviously looking at the blocking today, but if you wanted to run some continuous bridging, you can go ahead and select that. And there is also an option to run a notched member, which if you're running a continuous piece, you can notch out the lip. But the main one I wanted to look at today is just the blocking configurations. And for anyone, again, who's used that line-based option in the walls, it's very, very similar. You just pick your family type. It is placed by marker line. So the marker line is going to hit the center of your joist. So it's basically if that line represents the center of your blocking, the top or the bottom. So you are able to shift the blocking laterally according to that line. And then it's just how you want to space your blocking out. So if you don't want it placed in the first bay or in the last bay, you can basically increase these numbers. It'll start placing my piece of blocking in the second bay. This one here will end in the second to last bay. Or if you don't want it maybe in the last bay at all or the first bay, you can just set these down to 0. So these options here are really just to control your first and last bay. If ever you want to skip it or not place it at all, if the space between them is a bit tight. Then you've got an option to stagger them up here. So maybe let's give it a 2-inch stagger. Breaks up the pieces individually. And then for the actual spacing itself, if you do want it to skip every 2 bays, every 3 bays, you do have that option as well. By default, it's just going to place in every single bay. So last 2 options down here. We do have options to place top and bottom straps. So you can place strapping on top or on the bottom of your panel concurrently with your blocking. A nice little hack I like to use as well is that if ever you do just want to add the straps, but forego the blocking piece, then you can literally just set this to something like 100 bays. It won't place any blocking at all, but you'll still get the strap that's running the length of your floor. So if ever you just want the strapping, you could always essentially just tell it to skip a ridiculous number of bays, and then you'll just get that strap. And lastly, it's the same type of cutback configurations. So depending on if it's hitting the open side or hard side of the joist, if it's hitting the open side, we've got that cut back to plane 2. If it's hitting the hard side, it should sit on plane 1 so it doesn't run through your joist. And then to actually place these are super simple. You just go ahead and create the marker lines. And you've got a few different options to place these. You can run it by spacing. You can tell it maybe space these lines equally, maximum 3 feet apart. Just takes the length of your floor and spaces out those lines equally. But I'm just going to run this by spacing. So depending on the direction of my floor panel. So green is always your joist direction, and the red is just the direction of the floor panel. It'll place the first offset and then just continue the regular spacing. Finally, you can just assign your blocking type. And then you just say OK. And it'll place these marker lines. So these are actually just going to depict the center line of your blocking and where that runs. But again, with any of these marker lines, if ever you want to delete them, move them around, they can even be copy pasted. Just using your Revit commands. Basically, you can just exactly control where you want that blocking. And then you just hit regenerate. And you'll get the blocking that acts as the center line along this marker line. If ever you shift a line and regenerate, the blocking will move with it. So I did have it spanning in my last bay. And again, this is where you could always even click on the line, hit the properties, and you're able to modify it this way. So you can even go back and turn the blocking off in this case. But if ever you just want to adjust this quickly, you can even pull back the line, give a quick regen. And if it doesn't run through your entire bay, then you're not going to get that piece of blocking. So if you don't want to go back and adjust your blocking types, you can even just go ahead and modify these lines manually with Revit, pull them back. And you're also able to control the bays in that way as well. So the last thing I want to cover for today is just the floor trusses and how to create those. And for that, let me just copy and paste my floor over. So we'll start from scratch with a new floor. So the floor trusses have a bit of a different workflow than the walls or the floors. Initially, it's still very similar. You say create, pick either of the templates, depending if your trusses are going to be back to back or if they're wall trusses. But before I actually create the trusses, just want to highlight that if you go into the properties, it does look pretty identical to regular floors. But if you click on the joist properties, it's actually the same presets as our regular truss module. So essentially what we just need the floor module for is to space the trusses out and to also specify your truss depth. So you actually get the depth of those trusses since there's no supports to select from. But from here, if you just get those trusses spaced out correctly, the depth is correct, then you can actually go over and switch to the truss module if you want to manually modify these or maybe change out the webbing, modify them in the designer, or even run analysis on them. Then you can go ahead and switch over to the truss module. So just to show that out, I'm going to leave my trusses spaced 2 feet apart. My truss depth is also just going to be at 2 feet. I'm going to go ahead and just specify my member sizing. Maybe let me pick, let's pick a 362, 43 mils. Apply that to all my member types. And you do have to do basically the same set of settings for the joists or just kind of your trusses. And then in the end joists, which are just going to be, of course, your end trusses, they can have the exact same settings. So a little shortcut, instead of refilling the same presets 2 times, I'll go in the joists, I'll set up my member sizing, my webbing, basically get all this set up. I'll save an XML file. And then when I come in the end joists, I just load in that same file, which has all the exact same settings. So my member sizes, webbing, all of that's already set up. It's just going to save you from having to re-enter in the settings twice. So then once you just say OK, it automatically creates those truss assemblies. It's actually going to frame out the opening as well with some trusses. But for anyone who's used the roof trusses, the floors will create the exact same types of trusses that you can then modify in the truss module. So I'll just let these guys populate, and then we can actually go ahead in the truss module and modify them exactly the same way. So the only other thing I want to reiterate is that if you do have any kind of openings, we do frame that around with trusses, and there are the 2 marker types for that. So you can apply them the exact same way, and depending on if they're going to be the headers or the trimmers, it's modified with the exact same presets. So the main thing I really just want to highlight with the floor trusses is that you'll use this floor module, again, just to get the depth, to space them out. But if you want to run these through analysis, or if you want to maybe customize the webbing, you can actually then just switch to the floor module, or to the truss module, excuse me. And you're still able to click on the trusses, access the properties, and open them up in the designer. So from here, if you wanted to modify the webbing, or if you wanted to do any changes in these same settings, you don't have to go back to the floor properties and rechange them there. You can go about it the same way you would a roof truss, and it'll modify all identical trusses that it finds. So it treats it exactly the same way. So from here on out, it'll start regenerating my identical trusses. And if you did want to delete any of them or move them around, if you are just sticking with the truss module at this point, then you can just use your Revit commands. You can go around, you can delete them, you can manually move them if you want to. The trusses lets you do that just because it sees these as individual assemblies. The only thing to be wary of if you're doing that is that if you do switch back over to the floors, if you want to change the general spacing, then it will override those changes because it still technically is a panel. So to avoid any confusion, use the floors to get your truss depth, your spacing, and then switch over to the trusses and just pretend that they're roof trusses. So you can do all the same manual modifications that you're used to. And you're still able to access and change them through the properties. So that's going to be it for me today. I hope this was useful for some of you. And if there's any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them now.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. As she mentioned, we have time to answer a few questions. If you'd like to pose a question live, please raise your hand now by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel. Again, just please make sure that your mic is working correctly. While we wait for any questions to come through, I'd just like to remind everyone that the recording of the webinar will be sent through shortly after the session has closed. As always, please feel free to share the recording with any colleagues. And if you'd like to set up a one-on-one demo, we highly encourage you to reach out to our team after the session has ended. Our contact information will be available with the recording. All right, I'll just give it a few more seconds. Alrighty then, that looks like it's a wrap for today. Once again, I just want to say thank you to Christina and thank you to everyone who registered for the webinar. All right, I'll now be ending the webinar. Thank you.